Hello, everybody, and welcome to From Poverty to Progress, the channel that promotes an awareness and understanding of human material progress. My name is Michael Magoon. I am the author of the From Poverty to Progress book series. The first book in my book series is entitled From Poverty to Progress, and it explains the origin and causes of modern progress. My second book, which I am happy to announce is now available on pre-release, is called Promoting Progress, a radical new agenda to create abundance for all. I take the lessons learned from the theories in the first book and apply a concrete progress-based reform agenda to promote widely shared economic growth for all. And stay tuned to the end of this video for a free book giveaway. I'm going to be starting a series of videos which I entitle Why the Left is Wrong from the perspective of human material progress. You can see three things. One, the policies of the left are often undermining progress. Two, conservatives offer no real alternatives. So I believe what we need is a third option between the left and the right that promotes progress. And by progress, I mean the sustained improvement in the material standard of living of a large group of people over a long period of time. I believe the left is wrong about green energy. The left and climate activists grossly exaggerate the negative effects of fossil fuels and completely ignore the positive effects. More importantly, they ignore the vast scale of what they are trying to do by replacing fossil fuels with renewable energies. Fossil fuels, like all good things, have bad side effects. And just because something has a bad side effect, that doesn't mean it should be eliminated. But today in the media, whenever you hear about fossil fuels, all you hear about is why we need to get rid of it and replace it with green energy. Instead, I believe that we need to promote a progress-based energy policy. And by that I mean we need to promote long-term economic growth with an energy system that is abundant, affordable, and secure, and green energy cannot do this. I'm going to go over a number of points in this video. If you want more details, read my upcoming book, Promoting Progress. I don't think people realize just how much money is being spent on green energy. Between the years 2011 and 2021, a total of $5 trillion has been spent on green energy policies, mainly on solar and wind. And now it is up to $1 trillion per year, and it's growing each year. This makes green energy the single largest government program during peacetime in world history. And the results are not that impressive. Global carbon emissions are still increasing. And if you look at since 1990, when green energy started becoming a big deal, there really isn't a slowdown in trend at all. So by their own standards, if the goal of green energy is to radically reduce carbon emissions, there's no way you can say anything other than it has been a complete failure. Now you might say, well, in Western Europe, they're making good strides. And yes, Western Europe has managed to cut carbon emissions there, but they've done so not so much by increased solar and wind power, but by government policies that drive up the price of fossil fuels, for example, electricity or gasoline and diesel, and because of a stagnant economy. As measured in per capita GDP, the major countries of Western Europe have shown virtual stagnation. There's been a bit of a recovery since the 2008 recession, but now there's a new recession. So things have basically been stagnant for 15 years. And this is a longer time period than the Great Recession of the 1930s. A big part of this is actually intentional. Many Greens, they say they're about protecting the environment, but they actually have a hidden agenda. That is a degrowth agenda. In other words, they're opposed to economic growth. Then they deliberately want to undermine economic growth. Many of them also are just plain anti-capitalist. Their goal is not abundant renewable energy. Their goal is to make fossil fuels so expensive that it slows down economic growth. Now, I'm not saying all Greens believe this, but a significant portion of them do. So how can we be spending so much money and getting so few results? Well, the answer is quite simple. Solar and wind are not replacing fossil fuels. Solar and wind is being ramped up, but it's in addition to fossil fuels. If you look at the overall percentage of fossil fuels as a share of global economy, it is pretty much flat over the last 30 years. That, from the green perspective, is failure. And the reason is as simple as ABC. It's all about coal. What we've seen over the last 30 years has been a massive increase in coal production in Asia, and particularly China. Or you might say ABC is it's all about China and the rest of Asia. In 1980, when the green energy movement was just getting started, virtually all carbon emissions were in the wealthy Western societies. But that's not true anymore. Now it's primarily in Asia, particularly China, where carbon emissions are the highest. So if we want to push down carbon emissions, we need a policy that focuses on Asia, not on the United States and Europe. But that's exactly the opposite of what the green policies are. The Greens say they're for all of humanity, but in fact, they ignore the majority of humanity. More than 50% of mankind lives in East Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, and these regions have virtually no potential for green energy. When you look at solar resources, the only place in that area where there's significant amount of solar resources is in the Gobi Desert, which is an almost uninhabited part of China. Now, it's possible to put solar power there, but then you need long transmission lines, and those transmission lines are not going to run to India and Southeast Asia. For all practical purposes, solar power is simply not possible in these regions with current technologies. And it's even worse for wind power. Again, other than the Gobi Desert, there's virtually no wind resources at all. The United States and Western Europe are very unusual for having significant wind resources. So the results of green energy policies, by their own standards, have been very poor. They have failed to reduce carbon emissions, and quite frankly, I don't believe they ever will be able to do so given the current strategy. They've had virtually no effect on current temperatures or future temperatures. So they may say, we have a crisis coming up with global warming, but their policies aren't doing anything to stop it. And even worse, they've undermined economic growth in wealthy nations, particularly Western Europe. They've undermined the standard of living of the working class and the poor in wealthy nations. They've undermined the ability of developing nations to experience economic growth. And they've undermined the security of Europe and increase the power of Russia and China to increasingly totalitarian world powers. The worst impact of green energy policy is that they've kept other far more viable energy policies off the public agenda. And the reason are because of fundamental disadvantages in renewables. First of all, renewables only produce electricity. Now, that's only 19% of carbon emissions. So even if you were to eliminate all fossil fuels in electricity production, which I believe is extremely unlikely, you still only dealt with 19% of the problem. The production of solar, wind, and other renewables varies greatly by geography. There are some areas where solar and wind make sense, but in the vast majority of places where human beings live, they don't. Just as bad is that production varies greatly over time. For both solar and particularly wind, electricity production varies greatly from year to year, from season to season, from day to day, and even from hour to hour. This makes it very difficult to have a stable and affordable electric grid. Solar and wind are also extremely land intensive. The single most important thing from an environmental perspective is to protect habitat. Unfortunately, solar and wind uses up far more land than any other energy source. They're also very materials intensive. They need lots of steel and other materials that require mining. Another thing that's often not noticed is that if we want to electrify transportation, solar and wind, because of the factors I mentioned before, undermine those possibilities, both because they're more expensive and because they're highly variable over time. If we want a transportation infrastructure that is stable and people can rely on, we need cheap and stable electricity. And solar and wind can't do that. And even more to the point, quite simply, you cannot manufacture wind and solar without using coal. Fossil fuels are essential for the production of renewables. Now, in my first book, From Poverty to Progress, I established what I believe are the 5 keys to progress that enabled societies to move from poverty into progress. I'm not going to go into a lot of details here, but I do want to mention the 5th one, which is widespread usage of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are essential for progress, and we can't, then just because there are negative consequences of it, we can't be trying to eliminate it. Greens, quite simply, have the wrong goal. What we should be doing is replacing coal with a blend of natural gas, hydroelectric dams, and nuclear power. The exact blend will vary by region due to geography and the cost structure in that local area, but it is quite possible to build an electrical grid based on those 3 foundations and to gradually expand that electrical grid into transportation. If you want more details, see my book, Promoting Progress. And this is quite achievable. Over the last 2 centuries, we have seen 3 fundamental energy transitions. The first, before the Industrial Revolution, we got our energy from burning wood and from muscle power, whether humans or animals. And then during the Industrial Revolution, we added on coal as a means of producing energy. And that coal powered the Industrial Revolution. Then later in the 19th and in the first half of the 20th century, there was a second energy transition, which added on petroleum. It didn't replace coal, but it did add it on, particularly in the transportation structure. And right now, there's a third energy transition going on, which is moving from a coal and petroleum-based to natural gas, hydroelectric, and nuclear. I believe the best policy is not to undermine that transition, which is what Greens are trying to do. I believe we should promote that transition, both for economic growth and for the good of the environment. We need to complete the third energy transition. The advantages over this goal compared to the green policies are huge. First of all, we can lower the price of energy instead of raise it up, which will promote economic growth. And this is key, they will lower carbon emissions faster than green policies because solar and wind don't actually replace fossil fuels. They're in addition to it. But particularly with the use of natural gas, we can replace coal. This strategy requires very little government subsidies. In fact, we can cut government subsidies, whereas the green policies require enormous government subsidies. The third energy transition is likely to happen with only minor government interventions. We'll be able to make domestic high-value-added manufacturing viable, particularly in the United States. We will be able to electrify transportation, and we'll be able to increase energy security and undercut the power of authoritarian regimes. Green energy policies cannot do any of this. One thing the Greens forget is that fossil fuels are actually a category. Fossil fuels consist of coal, oil, and natural gas, and each one of them has very different properties. There's in fact a huge difference, particularly in environmental effects and in safety, between coal, which has by far the most carbon emissions and pollutions, and natural gas, which has by far the least. Natural gas, particularly in the most efficient power plants, has 1/3 the carbon emissions of coal and virtually no pollution of other kinds. So why do we treat them as though they're the same? Because they're not. I believe we need to move beyond coal and embrace natural gas. Natural gas, unlike solar and wind, can replace coal in many regions, particularly in the United States. Virtually every use of coal can be replaced by natural gas, and there's no other energy source that can do that. And in another episode, I'm going to go into more detail on these points, but if we combine shale gas and combined cycle gas turbines, we can radically reduce carbon emissions and make energy cheaper, which benefits economic growth over the long term. And this isn't fantasy. This has in fact already happened. Between 2005 and 2019, we've seen a very substantial decrease in carbon emissions in the United States. And according to the EIA, 65% of that decline was because of natural gas. The natural gas was replacing coal, whereas only 30% of that decline was due to renewable energy. The natural gas didn't require any subsidies at all, and yet it's reducing carbon's emissions more than renewable energies, which do require massive government subsidies. And the United States isn't the only one. Other countries have done the same. For example, peak coal usage in the United Kingdom was not in the 2000s. It was actually back in 1956. So what happened? Well, the United Kingdom started replacing its old coal-burning plants with, you guessed it, natural gas, mainly from the North Sea. And the same thing happened in Germany. The biggest declines in German coal usage was during the 1990s when natural gas plants were coming online. This is a proven strategy for reducing carbon emissions in a cost-effective way that also benefits the economy. Other nations have made similar transitions with nuclear power and hydroelectric. France, Belgium, and much of Eastern Europe replaced massive amounts of coal-burning plants with nuclear power. Norway and Canada did the same with hydroelectric, and Finland, Sweden, and Switzerland have done it with a blend of nuclear and hydropower. So we have many examples of the third energy transition radically lowering coal usage. We should continue with those policies. So I have a message to Greens. If you do not have a plan to replace coal plants in Asia, then you do not have a serious plan, because that's where the carbon emissions are coming from. And your plan cannot deal with that at all. There is simply no possibility that solar and wind will replace coal-burning power plants in China, India, Indonesia, and in the rest of Asia. It's not going to happen. So we need to come up with a better solution, and I believe the progress-based energy policy is far superior. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please don't forget to subscribe and like. It really helps the channel to grow. If you'd like more resources, I'd recommend going to my website, FromPovertyToProgress.com. With a free email subscription, you get free ebook samples, free audio samples, and you can buy discounted ebooks and audiobooks. If you insist on paying full price, you can get ebooks, paperbacks, and hardcovers at Amazon, or if you're a bookstore or a library, you can get them at Inker and Spark. Audiobooks are available at Amazon, Audible, and iTunes. If you'd like to know more about books related to this content, I'd recommend going to my other website, which is the techratchet.com. It consists of an online library of over 280 book summaries on the topics of technology, history, economic growth, and progress. And now we're getting on to the exciting part, a free book giveaway of my first book, From Poverty to Progress. If you're a regular listener, you already know the rules. If you don't know the rules, please pause this video and read this description. There's a free book giveaway every week. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you next time.